When three armed hitmen kicked in my farmhouse door at midnight, they expected to find a terrified, helpless woman begging for her life. My millionaire brother-in-law had paid them 50 grand to assassinate my sister and frame me for the murder. But when they leveled their shotguns at us in the freezing dark, they didn't pull the trigger. Instead, they dropped their weapons, went completely pale, and surrendered on the spot. Because they saw exactly what I was holding in my left hand. And they suddenly realized they weren't the hunters, they were the prey. I'm Harper, and this is the story of how I destroyed a high society monster without firing a single shot. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength doesn't roar, and the most dangerous weapon you can wield against an abuser is unshakable sisterhood and cold, hard intelligence. If you believe in women taking back their power and standing up to toxic family dynamics, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Share this video with a friend who might need a reminder of her own fierce strength today, and let me know in the comments. How do you deal with toxic people in your life? Now, let's get into the story. The sound of splitting wood shattered the quiet night. It was loud. It was violent. Heavy boots stomped across the hardwood floor of my isolated farmhouse. Outside, the storm raged. Rain lashed against the glass windows. Thunder rolled across the dark Montana sky. But inside my home, the air was dead and completely cold. Three men stood in my living room. They wore dark tactical clothes. They wore black ski masks. And they carried heavy, pump-action shotguns. They had one target tonight. That target was my younger sister, Clara. Clara was cowering behind me. Her hands gripped the back of my flannel shirt with desperate strength. She was trembling. She was crying softly. Her husband, Richard, had paid these men $50,000. He paid them to take her out. He wanted it to look like a tragic home invasion, a burglary gone horribly wrong in the middle of nowhere. These hired killers expected a very easy job. They expected to step right over me. To them, I was just Harper Bennett. I was the local town mechanic. I was a grease-stained, quiet woman who lived alone in the woods and fixed pickup trucks. They thought I would drop to my knees. They thought I would beg for my life. They raised their weapons in unison. The cold steel barrels pointed directly at my sister's chest. I did not scream. I did not panic. I did not move out of the way. I simply reached out my right hand. I clicked on the small reading lamp sitting on the wooden side table. Soft yellow light suddenly flooded the dark room. The sudden burst of light made the men flinch. They blinked behind their masks. And then their eyes dropped down. They looked directly at what I was holding in my left hand. I was not holding a heavy weapon. I was holding a small, black leather wallet. It was flipped wide open. Inside rested a solid gold federal badge. My Joint Special Operations Command ID, Tier 1 Federal Intelligence. Right beneath the gold badge was a thick manila folder. It was filled with Richard's offshore bank records and digital wire transfers. The lead hitman stared at the gold federal badge. The color completely drained from his face. His eyes went wide in the dim light. He slowly lowered his shotgun. The heavy barrel pointed toward the floorboards. He swallowed hard. His voice shook when he finally spoke. He didn't tell us who you were. No, Richard certainly did not, because Richard had absolutely no idea. To understand how my sister and I ended up in the crosshairs of three hired guns, you have to go back. You have to go back 3 months. You have to understand the toxic illusion of my perfect family. My name is Harper Bennett. To my mother, Margaret, I am a massive disappointment. I am the black sheep of the family. I wear steel-toed boots. I always have motor oil under my fingernails. I own a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. My shop sits on 50 acres of prime real estate. It was beautiful. Untouched land left to me by my late grandfather. Margaret hates my simple life. She values country club memberships. She values designer dresses, luxury cars, and high society gossip. She only cares about maintaining a perfect public image. That is exactly why she worships my sister's husband. Richard Sterling is a wealthy real estate developer. He is handsome. He is charismatic. He wears bespoke tailored suits and drives a $100,000 imported car to the outside world. Richard and Clara are the perfect couple. They are the king and queen of the local elite. They host the best parties. They donate to the right charities. But I always knew the truth. I saw the way Richard looked at my sister when the cameras were off. I saw the possessive, cold calculation in his eyes. Clara is sweet. She is gentle. She is highly anxious. She always tries to please everyone around her to avoid conflict. Richard saw that deep kindness and turned it into a weapon. He used it to control her. He slowly isolated her from her childhood friends. He managed every single penny she spent. He made her completely dependent on him. My mother refused to see the abuse. Margaret praised Richard constantly. She told Clara how lucky she was to have such a good, wealthy provider. She told me I should learn a thing or two from him about success, but my mother did not know my secret. My auto shop is just a civilian cover. Between fixing transmissions and changing oil, I deploy overseas. I am an active duty federal intelligence officer. I analyze deadly threats. I dismantle hostile networks. I know how to spot a dangerous predator. And Richard Sterling was a predator. The main conflict really started at Thanksgiving dinner. We were sitting around Margaret's lavish dining table. The crystal wine glasses sparkled. The silver was perfectly polished. Richard took a slow sip of his expensive red wine. He looked across the large table at me. His smile was arrogant. It was cruel and calculating. "Harper," Richard said loudly, "you are completely wasting that land. Your grandfather's estate is prime development territory. I can build a massive luxury subdivision there. Sign the deed over to my holding company. I will give you a fair price. You can buy a nice little condo in town and stop playing in the dirt." I set my fork down on the porcelain plate. I looked him dead in the eye. "The land is not for sale, Richard." "Never." His smile tightened. The charming mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. I saw the absolute rage underneath. He hated being told no. He hated losing his total control over the room. Clara looked down at her plate. She looked terrified. She did not say a single word. She just shrank into her expensive dining chair. Richard laughed, but it was a cold, hollow sound. "We will see about that. Harper, things change." He was used to bullying small people into total submission. He thought his money and his status made him untouchable. He thought I was just a stubborn, uneducated mechanic. He had no idea he had just declared war on a federal agent. And he had absolutely no idea what I was willing to do to protect my little sister. The high society facade is a very dangerous thing. It is a beautiful, glittering mask that hides incredibly ugly truths. I saw that mask slip a few weeks after that tense Thanksgiving dinner. It was the annual winter charity gala at the local country club. I absolutely hated these events. I hated the fake smiles and the shallow conversations, but Clara had called me crying. She begged me to come. She said she desperately needed a familiar face in the crowd. I agreed to go, but only for her. The massive ballroom was filled with local politicians, wealthy corporate executives, and their trophy wives. Real diamonds sparkled under the massive crystal chandeliers. Men in tuxedos smoked cigars on the balcony. Waiters carried silver trays filled with expensive champagne. It was a suffocating sea of expensive perfume and massive egos. I stood quietly near the back wall. I wore a simple black dress. I kept my distance from the crowd and watched my sister. Clara looked beautiful. She wore a stunning, floor-length red silk gown. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, but her eyes were completely empty. She looked like a fragile porcelain doll trapped inside a glass display case. Richard was holding court in the center of the room. He was surrounded by wealthy investors, laughing loudly and telling jokes. Clara stood silently next to him, nodding politely on command. At one point, a rushing waiter accidentally bumped into Clara's shoulder. A few drops of red wine spilled onto the edge of her expensive dress. It was an intense mistake. It was barely noticeable in the dim lighting. Richard stopped laughing immediately. He turned to Clara. His face remained perfectly calm to the crowd watching him, but his eyes were pure ice. He leaned in close to her ear. I could not hear his exact words over the music, but I saw his hand, his large fingers wrapped entirely around Clara's upper arm. He squeezed. He gripped her soft flesh with brutal, punishing force. Clara gasped softly. She tried to pull away from the pain, but he held her tight. She forced a bright smile for the wealthy people watching them, but tears welled up in her eyes. She was utterly terrified of him. I started to walk forward through the crowd. I was going to break his fingers right there in front of the mayor, but Clara saw me moving. She shook her head slightly. Her eyes pleaded with me from across the room. Please, don't. Do not make a scene. Keep the peace. I stopped walking. My blood boiled in my veins. I watched Richard parade her around the ballroom for the rest of the night. He was completely in control of her reality. He was destroying her soul, piece by piece, while everyone applauded him. 2 weeks later, the grand illusion finally shattered completely. Richard was out of state. He was hosting a major real estate seminar in Chicago to attract new investors. Clara was completely alone in their massive, echoing mansion. She was looking for a specific tax document that their accountant had requested. She walked into Richard's private home office. It was a cold, modern room. It had a heavy mahogany desk and dark leather chairs. Usually, his metal filing cabinets were strictly locked. He never let her see the finances. But today, one of the bottom drawers was left slightly open by mistake. Clara pulled the heavy drawer out. She reached inside looking for the tax file. Instead, she found a thick, red folder hidden deliberately in the very back. She opened it. Her heart stopped beating. The first document was a formal notice from the federal bank. It was stamped with bold red letters. Foreclosure, default. Richard's entire real estate empire was a complete lie. He was entirely bankrupt. He owed millions of dollars to very dangerous creditors. The bank was actively preparing to seize the mansion, the luxury cars, everything. He was ruined. Clara's hands shook violently. She flipped to the next page in the folder. It was a brand new life insurance policy. It had been officially signed and activated just 3 days ago. The policy was taken out on Clara's life. The total payout was $10 million. The sole beneficiary listed on the document was Richard Sterling. Clara stared at the printed numbers. $10 million. She read the fine print clauses. It covered accidental death, covered fatal home invasions. It covered absolutely everything. The horrifying truth hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She could hardly breathe. The expensive modern room started to spin around her. Richard was not just bankrupt. He was desperate. And a desperate narcissist is the most dangerous creature on earth. He was going to lose his country club status. He was going to lose his public wealth. To controlling men like Richard, public image is absolutely everything. They will do terrible things to keep the mask on. He had wanted my land to quietly bail out his failing company. When I refused to sell, he made a new plan. A much darker, final plan. He was going to kill her. He would collect the $10 million from the insurance company. He would play the grieving, wealthy widower for the cameras. He would completely save his precious empire. And my sister would just be a tragic memory. Cold panic seized her chest. Clara dropped the red folder back into the drawer. She backed away from the desk. She knew Richard had hidden cameras around the massive house. She knew he constantly monitored the security system from his phone in Chicago. She had to move immediately. She ran upstairs to her large bedroom. She grabbed a simple canvas duffel bag. She did not pack her designer clothes. She did not take her expensive jewelry. She packed a pair of jeans, 2 warm sweaters, and her passport. She waited in the dark until midnight. She disabled the GPS tracker on her luxury SUV. It was a security trick I had taught her months ago, just in case she ever needed to run. She drove frantically through the dark, winding mountain roads. The winter snow was falling hard, covering the asphalt. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. She was terrified Richard would magically appear in the rearview mirror to drag her back. At 2 in the morning, headlights flashed in my dirt driveway. I was already awake. I walked out onto the freezing front porch. Clara stumbled out of the running car. She did not even have a winter coat on. She was freezing and shaking violently. She ran up the wooden steps and collapsed heavily into my arms. She completely broke down. Deep, agonizing sobs tore through her chest. It was the devastating sound of a woman who had finally realized she was sleeping next to a monster. He is going to kill me. Harper, she whispered into my shoulder, tears soaking my shirt. He is going to kill me. I held her tight. I looked out into the dark. Freezing wood surrounding my property. No, he isn't, I said. My voice was incredibly calm. It was cold and absolute. He has no idea who he is dealing with. The trap was officially set. The high society mask was off. The war to save my sister had begun. The morning sun did not break through the heavy winter clouds. The Montana sky remained bruised, sullen gray, reflecting the cold reality inside my farmhouse. Clara sat at my rustic kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of black coffee. She had not slept a single wink. Dark purple circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Every time the old wooden house settled or the wind rattled the window panes, she flinched, expecting Richard to come crashing through the front door. I stood by the cast-iron stove, watching her carefully. I had already secured the perimeter. The heavy steel deadbolts were locked, and the motion sensors along the tree line were armed. But the real threat was not going to knock politely on the front door. The real threat was going to use psychological warfare first, right on cue. My cell phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The harsh electronic vibration echoed loudly in the quiet room. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed our mother's name, Margaret. I looked at Clara. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she shook her head frantically, begging me silently not to answer. I held up a hand to calm her down, took a deep breath, and swiped the green button. I put the phone on speaker and set it gently on the wooden table so Clara could hear exactly what we were dealing with. Harper, where is your sister? Margaret's voice snapped through the tiny speaker. There was no greeting. There was no maternal warmth. There was only sharp, cold irritation. Richard is beside himself with worry. He just called me from Chicago in a complete panic. He said Clara had some sort of hysterical breakdown last night and drove off in the middle of a blizzard. You need to put her on the phone right this second before she embarrasses this family any further. I leaned over the table, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. Clara is safe, Mother. That is all you need to know. She is staying with me until further notice. Margaret let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was the exact same condescending laugh she used at her country club luncheons when someone wore the wrong designer dress. Safe. Safe from what? Harper, her own imagination. Richard provides her with a beautiful mansion, luxury cars, and a lifestyle you could only dream of in your dirty little garage. She is acting like a spoiled, ungrateful child. Tell her to stop this ridiculous tantrum, get in her car, and go back to her husband where she belongs. I looked at Clara. Silent tears were streaming down her pale cheeks. 30 years. This was how our mother had conditioned her. She taught Clara that her feelings were invalid, that her safety was secondary to the family's public image, and that an abusive man was just a good provider if his bank account was large enough. Richard took out a $10 million life insurance policy on her yesterday. Mother, I stated coldly. His real estate company is bankrupt. He is facing federal foreclosure. He was planning to kill her to save his precious reputation. She is never going back to that house. There was a heavy pause on the line. For a split second, I thought the sheer horror of the truth might actually pierce Margaret's thick layer of denial. But I was wrong. That is the most absurd, jealous lie I have ever heard. Margaret hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. You have always hated Richard because he is successful, and you are a failure. You are brainwashing your sister. If you do not send her home right now, I am washing my hands of both of you. Good, I said softly. Consider them washed. I reached down and ended the call. I blocked her number immediately. I looked at Clara, who was staring at the dark phone. The last chain of her toxic childhood had just been snapped. She was finally free from the illusion, but we still had to survive the reality of Richard's wrath. I left Clara in the kitchen and walked down the hall to my private study. It was time to stop playing the defensive game. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and booted up my Panasonic Toughbook. It was a heavily encrypted, armor-plated military laptop that I used for classified deployments. I bypassed the civilian internet grid, connecting directly to a secure federal satellite uplink. I logged into the Joint Special Operations Command Intelligence Database, using my Tier 1 clearance credentials. I needed to know exactly what Richard was planning. I ran a deep digital sweep on Richard's recent communications, bypassing his standard email servers and diving into the encrypted dark web routing protocols he had been stupidly using on his office computer. Criminals in expensive suits always think they are digital ghosts, but they always leave a digital footprint. It took me less than 40 minutes to crack his proxy server and retrieve a deleted chain of encrypted messages. As I read the decrypted text on the glowing screen, my blood ran completely cold. Richard was not just hiring local thugs to murder Clara. He had crafted a masterpiece of narcissistic vengeance. The messages were instructions to a team of 3 private fixers. He had wired them $50,000 from a hidden offshore account. But the target parameters were highly specific. They were ordered to breach my farmhouse and kill Clara. But they were explicitly instructed to use my own hunting rifles to do it. Then, they were supposed to kill me and stage the scene to look like a murder-suicide. Richard's narrative was brilliantly sick. He was going to tell the police, the media, and the country club that his unstable, jealous, broke mechanic sister-in-law had kidnapped Clara, murdered her in a fit of psychotic rage, and then turned the gun on herself. It was the perfect alibi. He would get the $10 million. He would get rid of his wife. He would get rid of me. And he would inherit my grandfather's land all in one bloody night. He would play the ultimate tragic victim. I printed the offshore wire transfer receipts, the decrypted hit orders, and the bank foreclosure notices. I gathered the warm, freshly printed papers and placed them carefully inside a thick manila folder. I did not call the local police. Richard owned the local sheriff. I did not call the FBI. There was no time for federal bureaucracy to process a warrant. Richard's flight from Chicago was scheduled to land tomorrow morning. He needed the problem solved tonight. The hitmen were coming as soon as the sun went down. I walked out of the study and found Clara curled up on the living room sofa, shaking with fear. I sat down next to her and took her cold hands in mine. "Clara, look at me," I commanded gently. She forced her terrified eyes to meet mine. "They are coming here tonight. But you need to listen to me very carefully. You are not going to die. I am going to end this. You just have to trust me. Stay completely silent and follow my lead." The storm outside intensified as night fell, swallowing the farmhouse in pitch-black darkness. The wind howled through the dense pine trees, masking the sound of approaching vehicles. I sat in the center of the living room in total silence. I had instructed Clara to hide in the small study down the hall, sitting on the floor behind the heavy oak desk. I had stripped the farmhouse of its normal comforts. I flipped the main breaker in the utility closet, plunging the entire property into suffocating darkness. I did not board up the windows or barricade the doors. I wanted them to come inside. I wanted them to step directly into my controlled environment. At exactly midnight, I heard the faint, distinct crunch of heavy boots on the frozen gravel outside. There were 3 of them, moving with the clumsy overconfidence of hired thugs who thought they were hunting 2 helpless women. They did not bother picking the lock. They opted for brute force. A heavy boot slammed into the front door. The wood splintered violently, and the door flew open, crashing against the interior wall. The freezing winter wind immediately rushed into the hallway. 3 large figures stepped through the doorway, their tactical shotguns raised, sweeping the darkness with cheap weapon-mounted flashlights. "Check the kitchen. You 2 clear the back rooms," the lead hitman whispered aggressively. His voice was muffled behind a thick black ski mask. They moved into the living room, relying entirely on the narrow beams of their flashlights. This was their first fatal mistake in tactical warfare. Whoever controls the environment controls the enemy. They expected me to be cowering in a closet. They did not expect a Tier 1 intelligence officer who had spent a decade neutralizing hostile threats in completely blind environments. As they crossed the center of the living room, I hit a remote switch in my hand, high-intensity, military-grade strobe lights, which I had mounted in the corners of the ceiling. erupted simultaneously. The blinding, rapid-fire flashes of pure white light instantly destroyed their night vision and caused massive spatial disorientation. The hitmen shouted in panic, throwing their arms up to shield their eyes. They stumbled backward. Their shotguns was waving erratically in the flashing chaos. "What the hell is that? Shoot the lights," one of them screamed, completely losing his tactical composure. I moved through the flashing shadows like a ghost, my footsteps completely silent on the familiar floorboards. I systematically slammed and locked the heavy internal doors behind them, herding them down the hallway like cattle in a chute. They bumped into each other, cursing, blinded, and terrified by an environment that was actively fighting back. They pushed forward, desperate to escape the blinding strobes, pushing straight toward the only open door at the end of the hall, the door to the study. They burst into the small room. The strobe lights did not reach in here. The room was dark, save for a single small reading lamp sitting on the side table. Clara was backed into the corner, screaming in genuine terror as the three masked men aimed their shotguns directly at her chest. "Got her. Grab the sister and let's finish this," the leader barked, racking the pump of his shotgun with a loud, metallic clack. I stepped out from the dark corner directly behind the lamp, placing my body firmly between the three shotgun barrels and my trembling sister. The hitmen froze. They expected a crying mechanic begging for mercy. They expected easy prey. Instead, they found a woman standing perfectly straight, completely unbothered by the weapons pointed at her face. I did not have a rifle. I did not have a shotgun. In my right hand, pointed casually at the floor, was a suppressed tactical sidearm. But it was my left hand that commanded their attention. I held my hand directly under the yellow glow of the reading lamp. Resting in my palm was my open leather wallet, displaying the gleaming gold Joint Special Operations Command federal badge. Right beneath it was the thick manila folder I had printed earlier. "Before you make the biggest mistake of your miserable lives, you need to listen very closely," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with absolute, freezing authority. "You are being played." The lead hitman stared at the gold badge. The arrogance melted off his face instantly. The barrel of his shotgun began to dip toward the floor. "In this folder," I continued, tapping the manila envelope, "is the offshore wire transfer Richard Sterling used to pay you $50,000. It is linked to an account that is already being monitored by federal authorities for severe corporate embezzlement. Richard is completely bankrupt. He took out a $10 million insurance policy on my sister. He hired you to kill her, and he explicitly ordered you to frame me for it." The three men looked at each other, the reality of the situation rapidly crashing down on them. They were not dealing with a simple domestic hit. They had just kicked in the door of a highly decorated federal agent. "If you shoot a federal officer and her sister tonight, Richard is not going to protect you," I said softly, driving the final psychological nail into their coffins. "He is going to use this paper trail to anonymously tip off the FBI. He collects $10 million and plays the grieving widower. You get life in federal prison for the assassination of a government official. You aren't his hitmen, boys, you are his fall guys." The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Clara's ragged breathing. The hitmen looked at the federal ID. They looked at the thick stack of bank records. They realized they were dealing with a sociopathic employer who had set them up to take the fall for his financial crimes. The leader slowly reached up and pulled off his black ski mask. His face was pale and sweating. He looked at me with absolute defeat. He carefully set his shotgun on the floor and kicked it away. The other two men immediately followed his lead, dropping their weapons onto the hardwood. "We didn't know," the leader whispered, holding his empty hands up in surrender. "He didn't tell us who you were. What do you want us to do?" I smiled coldly. "You are going to sit on that floor, and you are going to tell the FBI exactly what Richard hired you to do. Because tomorrow morning, my sister and I are going to pay her husband a little visit." The Oakmont Country Club was the absolute pinnacle of local high society. On a Sunday morning, the grand dining room was a sea of crisp white linen tablecloths, sparkling mimosa glasses, and quiet. Expensive conversations, wealthy developers, local politicians, and their immaculately dressed wives gathered to see and be seen. Sitting right in the center of the room, holding court at the most prominent table, was Richard Sterling. He was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored bespoke suit. He looked incredibly handsome, but his face was set into a carefully practiced mask of deep, agonizing concern. Sitting directly across from him was my mother, Margaret, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk napkin, playing the role of the distressed mother-in-law to absolute perfection. Richard kept his expensive smartphone sitting right next to his porcelain coffee cup. He was waiting. He was waiting for the local sheriff to call and deliver the tragic, devastating news that his beloved wife and his estranged sister-in-law had been found dead in a horrific murder-suicide at the farmhouse. He had undoubtedly spent his entire morning in Chicago establishing his ironclad alibi before flying back on his private jet, ready to accept the condolences of the local elite and quietly collect his $10 million insurance payout. But the phone never rang. Instead, the heavy oak double doors of the country club dining room swung open with a violent, echoing crash that instantly silenced the entire room. The wealthy patrons stopped eating. Silverware clattered against fine china as every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. Walking through the doors were 6 federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. And walking right behind them, completely unharmed and standing taller than she ever had in her entire life, was Clara. I walked right beside her, wearing my worn leather jacket and steel-toed boots, completely out of place in the seas of designer gowns, but absolutely commanding the space. Richard saw us, and the color completely drained from his arrogant face. He looked like a man who had just seen 2 ghosts walking out of a graveyard. The charming, controlled mask he had worn for years shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. He gripped the edge of the linen-covered table, his knuckles turning stark white, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. The lead FBI agent marched straight across the dining room, completely ignoring the shocked whispers of the wealthy patrons. He stopped directly at Richard's table. Richard Sterling, the agent's voice boomed, carrying easily over the dead silence of the room. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, federal wire fraud, and severe corporate embezzlement. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back. This is a mistake. Do you know who I am? Richard finally choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He scrambled backward, nearly knocking over his expensive chair, but 2 federal agents grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back with practiced, unforgiving force. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the dining room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her face contorted in absolute horror as she watched her perfect, wealthy son-in-law being manhandled like a common street criminal. As the agents dragged a humiliated, weeping Richard toward the exit, Margaret finally snapped out of her shock. She stood up frantically, her heavy diamond jewelry rattling. She looked at Richard. Then she looked at Clara. Survival instinct kicked in. Margaret instantly tried to rewrite history to save her own social standing in front of her friends. Clara, oh, my sweet daughter. Margaret cried out, forcing fake tears into her eyes as she rushed forward with her arms wide open. I was so terribly worried. I had no idea he was such a monster. Thank goodness you are safe. Come here to your mother. Clara did not move. She did not shrink back. She stood her ground, raised her hand, and pointed a single, trembling finger directly at Margaret's chest. Stop right there, Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a new, unbreakable steel that I had never heard before. Margaret froze in her tracks, looking completely bewildered. Clara, sweetheart, it's me. You knew I was suffering, Clara said, her voice echoing clearly for the entire country club to hear. You saw the bruises. You saw him isolate me. You saw the fear in my eyes every single day. And you chose to look the other way because His bank account paid for your country club dues. You helped him gaslight me. You told me I was crazy. You would have let him kill me just to keep your perfect public image intact. Margaret's jaw dropped. The wealthy women at the surrounding tables were staring at her in absolute disgust. Her social reputation was completely incinerated in an instant. You chose a monster over your own daughter's life, Clara stated, her eyes completely dry and burning with fierce independence. We are no longer family. Do not ever contact me or my sister again. Clara turned her back on our mother, linked her arm firmly through mine, and we walked out of the silent dining room, leaving the toxic illusion of our family in the dust forever. 1 year later, the harsh Montana winter had finally melted away, replaced by the bright, blooming colors of a beautiful spring. The old farmhouse on our grandfather's estate looked completely different now. The splintered front door had been replaced with reinforced steel, and the dark, empty rooms were now filled with light, laughter, and purpose. We did not sell the land to developers. Instead, Clara and I poured our resources into transforming the massive 50-acre property into the sanctuary, a secure, fully funded retreat for women escaping domestic violence and financial abuse. Justice had been remarkably swift and absolute. Richard Sterling was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his wealth, his status, and his freedom. The three hitmen had taken a plea deal, testifying against Richard in exchange for lesser sentences, but they were still securely behind bars. Margaret had been completely ostracized from her beloved high society. Without Richard's money, and facing the public humiliation of the country club confrontation, she sold her house and moved away in disgrace. We never spoke to her again. Clara had completely transformed. The fragile, terrified woman who had run through the blizzard with nothing but a canvas bag was gone. In her place stood a strong, radiant survivor. She managed the daily operations of the sanctuary, using her own harrowing experience to guide, comfort, and empower other women who arrived at our gates broken and terrified. Watching her laugh in the garden with the other survivors, completely free from fear, was the greatest victory of my entire military career. The camera angle shifts slightly, and Harper looks directly into the lens, breaking the narrative barrier to speak directly to you, the viewer. If there is one thing Clara and I want you to take away from this story, it is that true strength does not always roar, and monsters do not always hide in the dark alleys. Sometimes, they wear incredibly expensive suits. They charm your family. They pay the dinner tabs. And they hide right behind country club memberships. Richard used money, status, and fear to build an invisible, suffocating prison for my sister. He thought that because we were women, because Clara was gentle and I was just a humble mechanic, we would quietly submit to his abuse and let him pull the strings. But abusers always underestimate the fierce, unbreakable bond of sisterhood. Blood merely makes you related by a biological accident. But loyalty, respect, believing victims when they speak, and protecting one another from harm, that is what actually makes you family. We are so often taught as women to just keep the peace, to smile through the subtle disrespect, and to let the charming, aggressive men run the show to avoid causing a scene. But your peace should never, ever come at the cost of your safety, your sanity, or your dignity. You have a fundamental, absolute human right to be treated with respect. You have the right to demand financial independence. You have the right to live without fear in your own home. Equality is not just a political buzzword we hear on the news. It is a standard of living that starts right inside our living rooms, in our marriages, and in our family dynamics. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. And never be afraid to set a boundary made of solid steel. If you resonated with Clara's journey from fear to total freedom, or if you connected with my fierce need to protect the people I love, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment down below with the word sanctuary so I know that you made it to the very end of the video. I also want you to tell me in the comments, how do you set firm boundaries with toxic family members in your own life? Let's build a community of strong, supportive, and fierce women in the comments section below. And please, take a second to share this video with a friend or a sister who might really need a reminder of her own incredible strength today. And finally, I want to leave you with a very real, very serious warning. Financial abuse, extreme jealousy, forced isolation, and coercive control are often the silent, invisible precursors to severe physical violence. If you or someone you love is in a relationship where you are being isolated from your friends, where your money is controlled, or where you are stripped of your independence, please reach out for professional help immediately. You are not alone. You are not crazy. And you absolutely have the power and the right to take your life back. Please check the description box below this video for completely confidential links to domestic abuse hotlines, financial recovery programs, and safety resources. Stay safe, stay strong, protect your sisters, and I will see you in the next story. The healing process is never a straight line, and the work of protecting the vulnerable is never truly finished. 2 years after Richard was locked away in a federal penitentiary, the sanctuary was operating at full capacity. Our grandfather's sprawling estate had been transformed into a fortress of healing. The perimeter was secured with reinforced steel fencing, high-definition thermal cameras, and silent alarms. But inside those heavy gates, it was a place of profound peace. We had built community gardens, therapeutic art studios, and private counseling rooms. Clara was the heart and soul of the entire operation. She had taken the darkest, most terrifying chapter of life and forged it into a beacon of hope for other women who had nowhere else to turn. It was late October, and the biting Montana chill had already begun to freeze the ground. The wind howled through the dense pine trees, shaking the heavy branches and rattling the reinforced windows of the main house. I was in my private study, running a routine security diagnostic on our external servers, when the perimeter breach alarm chimed softly on my laptop. It was not a blaring siren. We had designed the system to be completely silent so as not to trigger the anxiety of the women sleeping in the residence halls. A small red indicator blinked on the digital map of the property, showing a disturbance at the main southern gate. I immediately pulled up the live feed from the thermal cameras. Through the grainy black and white infrared display, I saw a small, frantic heat signature huddled directly against the heavy steel bars of the entrance. It was a woman. She was not alone. Clutched tightly against her chest was a second, much smaller heat signature, a child. I did not hesitate. I grabbed a heavy winter coat, clipped my secure communication radio to my belt, and stepped out into the freezing hallway. Clara was already coming down the stairs, tying the belt of a thick wool cardigan around her waist. She had seen the notification on her own secure tablet. We did not need to exchange a single word. The silent communication between us was flawless. I was the tactical shield, but Clara was the emotional anchor. We walked out into the freezing night together, the icy wind immediately biting at our exposed faces. We approached the heavy steel gates cautiously. The floodlights illuminated a young woman who could not have been older than 25. She was completely soaked from the freezing rain, shivering violently, and desperately clinging to a little girl who looked to be about 4 years old. The woman's face was bruised, her lip was split, and her eyes were wide with the sheer, primal terror of a hunted animal. She looked exactly the way Clara had looked on that freezing night when she first arrived at my doorstep. "Please," the young woman sobbed, her voice trembling so hard it was barely audible over the roaring wind. "They told me at the women's clinic in town that you could help. He is looking for us. If he finds us, he is going to kill us. Please, you have to let us in." I kept my hand resting near the heavy steel latch of the gate, scanning the dark tree line behind her for any signs of pursuit. "What is your name?" I asked, my voice calm, projecting absolute authority to ground her panic. "Evelyn," she cried, clutching her daughter tighter. "My name is Evelyn. My husband is a city councilman in Helena. He has the police in his pocket. I have no money. I have no car. I have nowhere else to go." Before I could even initiate the standard security protocol, Clara stepped forward. She pressed her hands gently against the cold steel bars, looking directly into Evelyn's terrified eyes. Clara did not see a security threat. She saw herself. "Evelyn, look at me," Clara said. Her voice was incredibly warm, steady, and filled with a quiet, unshakable strength. "You are safe now. Do you hear me? He cannot touch you here. Nobody is going to hurt you or your little girl ever again." Clara nodded at me. I punched the security code into the keypad. The heavy steel gates groaned as they swung open, parting just enough to let Evelyn and her daughter slip through. Clara immediately took off her thick wool cardigan and wrapped it tightly around Evelyn's shivering shoulders. She guided the exhausted mother and child toward the warmth of the main house, murmuring soft, comforting words of reassurance. I stood at the gate for a moment longer, staring out into the dark, freezing highway. A city councilman, a man with political power, wealth, and influence. It was the exact same toxic breed of predator as Richard. These men always believed that their status made them completely invincible. They believed that they could break women without any consequences. I pulled the heavy steel gates shut, locking the deadbolts into place with a loud, satisfying mechanical clack. I welcomed the challenge. Let him try to come for her. He was about to find out that this sanctuary was guarded by a ghost he could not intimidate and a sisterhood he could not break. The retaliation came much faster than I anticipated. It was barely 8 o'clock the following morning when a sleek, black, heavily tinted SUV rolled to a stop at the bottom of our long dirt driveway. The storm had passed, leaving the Montana morning air crisp, cold, and deceptively peaceful. I was already sitting in the security control room, drinking my second cup of black coffee, watching the high-definition cameras capture every single angle of the vehicle. 2 men stepped out of the SUV. They were not local police officers, and they certainly were not federal agents. They wore expensive, tailored charcoal suits that looked completely ridiculous in the rugged mountain environment. They had the stiff, aggressive posture of private security contractors' hired muscle, dressed up to look like legal professionals. They walked up to the call box mounted next to the reinforced gate and pressed the button aggressively. I clicked the intercom microphone. "State your business," I demanded, my voice echoing through the external speakers. The taller of the 2 men leaned into the speaker. He wore a smug, condescending smile. "My name is Marcus Vance. I am the lead legal counsel for Councilman Arthur Vance. We have reason to believe that his wife, Evelyn, is currently being held on this property against her will. Open this gate immediately so we can escort her and her child back to their legal residence. Or I will have the local sheriff up here with a search warrant in 10 minutes. He was trying to play the intimidation game. He was trying to use legal threats and aggressive posturing to force us into a panic. He assumed we were just a small, disorganized charity run by frightened women." I muted the microphone and turned to Clara, who was standing right behind my chair. She was holding a fresh mug of tea, her expression completely unbothered. "Are you ready?" I asked her, raising a single eyebrow. Clara took a calm sip of her tea and smiled. "Let's go greet our guests." We walked out of the main house and strode down the long gravel driveway toward the front gate. We did not hurry. We took our time, projecting complete control of the environment. When we reached the steel barrier, Marcus crossed his arms, looking us up and down with obvious disdain. "Are you the ones running this illegal halfway house?" Marcus sneered. "Listen to me very carefully, ladies. You are harboring a mentally unstable woman who has kidnapped a child. You are interfering with a prominent political figure's family. Open the gate. Hand her over. And we will forget this ever happened. If you refuse, I will personally see to it that you are both arrested for kidnapping, and this entire property is seized by the county." Clara stepped right up to the gate. She did not flinch. She looked the arrogant lawyer dead in the eye. "Evelyn is a guest of the sanctuary. She is here voluntarily. And as of this morning, she has retained our federal legal team. You do not have a warrant. You do not have jurisdiction. And you are currently trespassing on private property." Marcus laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Federal legal team. You fix cars and run a charity for hysterical women. You don't have any real power. I stepped forward, pulling a thin manila envelope from the inside pocket of my jacket. I slipped it through the steel bars. Marcus caught it, looking confused. "Open it, Marcus," I said softly. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As his eyes scanned the document, his smug smile completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated dread. "That is a transcript of an encrypted phone call you made at 2 in the morning to a known local enforcer," I explained, my voice as cold as the morning frost. "You offered him $10,000 to physically assault a judge who was presiding over one of the councilman's zoning disputes. Below that is a list of offshore accounts where your boss hides his embezzled campaign funds. I am an active duty Tier 1 intelligence officer for the federal government. I ran a full diagnostic on your entire miserable network while I was drinking my morning coffee." Marcus swallowed hard, his hands physically shaking as he held the paper. His hired Pumsottle took a nervous step backward. "If you ever come near this property again, or if Councilman Vance ever attempts to contact Evelyn in any way, shape, or form," I continued, leaning intimately close to the steel bars, "I will not call the local sheriff. I will hand this entire dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit. You will be disbarred, and your boss will spend the next 20 years in a federal prison cell right next to my brother-in-law. Do you understand me?" Marcus could not speak. He was completely outmatched, outgunned, and outsmarted. He crumpled the paper in his fist, turned around without a single word, and walked quickly back to the SUV. His security guard scrambled after him. The heavy doors slammed shut, the tires spun in the loose gravel, and the vehicle sped away, retreating back to the city. I turned to look at Clara. She was smiling, breathing in the cold, clean mountain air. We had faced down another monster, and we had not even needed to raise our voices. The sanctuary was safe. The sisterhood remained unbroken, and as long as we were standing at that gate, no abuser would ever cross our threshold again. The heavy steel gates of the sanctuary remained securely locked, standing as an impenetrable fortress against the outside world. Inside the main house, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the freezing, bitter Montana wind that battered the reinforced window panes. A massive fire roared in the stone hearth of the living room, casting a warm, golden glow across the worn hardwood floors and the comfortable, oversized furniture. Evelyn sat on a plush sofa closest to the fire, a thick woolen blanket draped securely over her shoulders. Her young daughter, Lily, was fast asleep in her lap, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The terror that had gripped Evelyn just 24 hours ago was slowly beginning to thaw, replaced by a fragile, cautious sense of disbelief. Clara sat in the armchair opposite them, holding a steaming mug of chamomile tea, her posture radiating quiet, grounding empathy. I stood in the doorway of the living room, leaning casually against the wooden frame. I had just finished my final perimeter sweep and double-checked the digital encryption on our external servers. Marcus, the arrogant lawyer, had not returned. There had been no local sheriffs with fabricated search warrants, no unmarked black SUVs idling at the bottom of the dirt driveway. My counterstrike had worked perfectly. I had given them a tiny glimpse of the federal arsenal I possessed, and like all bullies who are suddenly confronted with real, unyielding power, they had tucked their tails and run back to the safety of their city. But I knew better than to drop my guard. Predators like Councilman Arthur Vance rarely surrendered after a single defeat. They simply retreated into the shadows to scheme, recalculate, and search for a softer target. Clara leaned forward, her voice a soothing, melodic whisper designed not to wake the sleeping child. "You are safe, Evelyn, I promise you. The men who came to the gate this morning have been permanently neutralized. They will not come back here, and Arthur will never be able to reach you again." Evelyn looked down at her daughter, a single tear tracing a clean path through the faint bruising on her cheek. "I just do not understand how you made them leave," she whispered, her voice trembling with leftover adrenaline. "Arthur is a city councilman. He has the entire local police department on his payroll. He told me that if I ever tried to run, he would have me arrested for kidnapping, and no judge in the state would ever believe a word I said. He made me feel like I was completely crazy. He made me feel like I was a ghost trapped in my own life. Clara reached across the space between them and gently covered Evelyn's shaking hand with her own. "I know exactly how that feels," Clara said, her eyes reflecting the deep, hard-won wisdom of her own survival. "My husband was a millionaire real estate developer. He wore bespoke suits, hosted charity galas, and everyone in our town thought he was a saint, but behind closed doors, he systematically dismantled my entire reality. He controlled my bank accounts, isolated me from my friends, and convinced my own mother that I was mentally unstable. That is the playbook they all use. Evelyn, they build a golden cage. And then they convince you that you are the one who locked the door." I watched my sister speak, feeling an overwhelming surge of pride. Clara was no longer just a survivor. She had become a fierce, highly effective healer. She knew exactly how to navigate the complex psychological minefields of domestic abuse because she had walked through them herself. While Clara tended to the emotional triage, my mind was entirely focused on the tactical horizon. I pushed off the doorframe and walked silently down the hall to my secure communication room. I locked the heavy door behind me and sat down at the bank of glowing monitors. I had promised Marcus that I would not submit the dossier to the FBI if Vance stayed away, but I never promised that I would stop digging. As an intelligence officer, leaving a hostile threat in play was against my fundamental nature. I bypassed the local servers again and initiated a deep dive algorithm into Arthur Vance's political action committees. What I found over the next 3 hours made my blood run completely cold. Vance was not just a domestic abuser. He was a systemic predator who used his political office to silence multiple women. I uncovered a heavily encrypted ledger hidden beneath layers of shell companies. The ledger detailed massive hush money payouts, fabricated legal settlements, and aggressive intimidation campaigns directed at female staffers who had attempted to report his abhorrent behavior. He was operating a sophisticated syndicate of coercion right in the heart of the state capitol. I leaned back in my tactical chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. Protecting Evelyn was no longer just about defending the perimeter of the sanctuary. It was about severing the head of the snake. Richard Sterling had taught me that you cannot simply build a wall to keep monsters out. Sometimes you have to walk directly into their caves and drag them into the blinding light. Councilman Arthur Vance thought he was invincible because he held a political office. He was about to learn that true power does not come from a voting ballot. True power comes from the absolute refusal to let another woman be broken. The annual Helena Civic Leadership Gala was the most exclusive political event of the year. The grand ballroom of the state capitol building was dripping in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over the state's most powerful politicians, wealthy lobbyists, and elite corporate donors. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos carried silver trays of imported champagne through the massive crowd. A classical string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the corrupt backroom deals being whispered over expensive caviar. Councilman Arthur Vance was in his absolute element. He stood near the grand staircase, wearing a tailored tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of bourbon, and flashing a brilliant, perfectly practiced smile for the local press photographers. He projected the image of a devoted public servant, a pillar of the community, and a man destined for higher office. He looked incredibly confident. He had no idea that a ghost was already inside the building. I did not bother with an invitation. I did not wear a designer gown. I bypassed the heavy security perimeter at the front entrance by using a classified federal bypass code on the building's service elevator. I slipped through the kitchen corridors, moving with the silent, practiced efficiency of a Tier 1 operative. I was wearing a sharp, dark charcoal blazer, black trousers, and my worn steel-toed boots. I blended into the shadows of the historic building perfectly. I was not there to make a public scene. I was there to deliver a surgical strike. I bypassed the ballroom entirely and made my way to the private VIP suites on the second floor. Vance's security detail had completely abandoned their posts to enjoy the catered food downstairs, arrogant in their belief that nobody would dare threaten a councilman at a public gala. I found the door with Vance's name engraved on a brass plaque. I picked the heavy mechanical lock in less than 10 seconds, stepped inside the dark, plush office, and waited. 20 minutes later, the door handle clicked. Arthur Vance walked into the dark office, loosening his silk bow tie and letting out an exhausted sigh. Before he could even reach for the light switch, I spoke. "I wouldn't turn that on, Arthur. You look much better in the dark." Vance froze completely. The crystal bourbon glass in his hand trembled. He squinted into the shadows, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light spilling in from the city streets outside the window. He saw me sitting casually in his heavy leather chair behind his mahogany desk. "Who the hell are you?" Vance demanded, his voice dropping into an aggressive, threatening growl. "How did you get past my security? If you are a reporter, you have exactly 3 seconds to get out of my office before I have you arrested." I did not move. I simply placed a thick, heavy manila folder onto the center of his polished desk. "My name is Harper Bennett," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I am the woman who owns the sanctuary. And I am the federal intelligence officer who completely dismantled your lawyer yesterday morning." The aggression evaporated from his face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale in the moonlight. He took a hesitant step backward toward the door. "I brought you a gift, Arthur," I continued, tapping the thick folder. "Inside this envelope is a complete, unredacted copy of your encrypted ledger. I have all the wire transfers, the hush money payouts, the fabricated legal NDAs, and the names of the 5 female staffers you systematically terrorized over the last 4 years. I also have the medical records documenting the physical abuse your wife, Evelyn, suffered at your hands." Vance swallowed hard, his arrogant political mask crumbling into dust. "What do you want?" he whispered, the panic finally breaking through his voice. "How much money do you want to bury this?" I stood up slowly, stepping around the heavy mahogany desk until I was standing just a few feet away from him. "You still do not understand," I said softly, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "I do not want your dirty money. I want your total surrender. By 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, you are going to hold a press conference. You are going to resign from the city council, citing severe personal health reasons. You are going to immediately sign full, uncontested custody of Lily over to Evelyn. You will transfer half of your remaining liquid assets into a secure trust fund for your daughter, and you will never, ever attempt to contact Evelyn again." Vance's jaw clenched. "And if I refuse?" he challenged, a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim his lost power. "If you refuse," I replied, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper, "I will not just leak this to the press. I will hand this dossier directly to the federal prosecutor's office. You will not just lose your political career, Arthur. You will lose your freedom, your assets. And you will spend the next 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The choice is entirely yours. But I promise you, if you ever look in my sister's direction, or Evelyn's direction again, I will become your absolute worst nightmare." I did not wait for his answer. I did not need to. The sheer terror in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I walked past him, opened the heavy oak door, and disappeared back into the shadows of the Capitol building. The next morning, exactly at 8 o'clock, Councilman Arthur Vance officially resigned in disgrace on live television. The sanctuary had not just survived, it had conquered. Clara and I had proven that the strongest weapon in the world is not a gun, and it is not a political office. The strongest weapon in the world is the unbreakable solidarity of women who refuse to be silent ever again. As we reach the end of Harper and Clara's journey, the echoes of their courage leave us with a profound and necessary truth. Monsters always lurk in dark alleyways wearing ski masks. Sometimes they wear bespoke suits, drive luxury cars, and hide behind the gleaming facade of a country club membership. They use wealth, political status, and psychological manipulation to build invisible prisons, conditioning their victims to believe that control is just another word for love. But this story breaks that toxic illusion wide open. It teaches us that biological ties are merely accidents of birth. True family is built on loyalty, respect, and the fierce willingness to stand between the people you love and the harm that comes for them. Clara's journey teaches us that no matter how deep the trauma goes, no matter how heavy the chains of coercive control feel, you always have the absolute right to break free. You have a fundamental human right to financial independence, to physical safety, and to mental peace. Harper showed us that true power isn't about physical dominance or violence. It's about tactical intelligence, setting boundaries made of solid steel, and never shrinking yourself to make an abuser comfortable. Equality and human rights aren't just abstract political concepts. They start right inside our own homes. When you see someone drowning in a toxic relationship, don't look the other way to keep the peace. Be the sanctuary they need. Believe women. Support survivors. And remember that when we stand together in unbreakable solidarity, no amount of money, manipulation, or political power can ever defeat us. You are stronger than you think, and you are never alone. This content was researched, built, and manually edited by us to bring meaningful value and life lessons.